All right, it's that time, so why don't we go ahead and get started? One quick housekeeping thing before we get too far along. So I put out the call for volunteers to play D&D, and I got responses. So for the couple of y'all who did respond, thank you very much. I'll be in contact with you about the specifics. For everybody else, enjoy the class on Friday and next Monday, and maybe you'll learn a little bit about it. And there are plenty of places around to play D&D if you should be so inclined. But yeah, so we'll talk about that next time. For today, oh, and as a reminder, on Friday, your second essay is due. So again, look at the guide. Sorry, over here. Essay number one, rewrite, or not essay number one, essay guide, and you will turn it into essay number two, reaction analysis. So yeah, make sure you get those done. Email me if you have any questions or things like that. But without further ado, let us get back to our discussion of Ciaphas Cain, Hero of the Imperium, for the last day. And I hope you enjoyed this book. If not, I hope you at least found it short and easy to read. So, yeah. So, we're continuing with Chapter 10. And I want to point out this piece, some of these pieces, especially from this military historian character, whose name I've forgotten because he's that totally irrelevant. He is just a generic citizen of the planet who is kind of dumb and doesn't know what's going on. He says, if anything at all can be said to have been learned from these terrible events, it must surely be this, that however benign they may appear, the alien is not to be trusted, and that turning aside from the word of the Emperor in even the smallest respect is the most certain route to damnation for us all. And it's a nice little reminder of this inherent xenophobia in the Imperium, that they not only distrust alien races, they actively hate them and argue to cleanse them from the galaxy. And that's a mainstream view. In fact, most would argue for trust and, cooperation with the benign ones are viewed as idiots and fools who are going to damn us all for their lack of rigor and their lack of hatred. So it's a reminder that this is a dystopian world, that this is not a nice place to be. But I think we also, one of these underwriting themes is about this xenophobia, and can we cooperate with other species? Can we cooperate with cultures that are different from us? And I think very much that Sandy Mitchell is arguing, yes, we can. Yes, we should. Look at how Cain and the Imperial Guard interact with the Tau diplomats when they're escorting them to the city. They work with one another. They understand one another. They can actually, plan together and make, the Tau, are the ones who help them get through the gates and get out safely when they would have been attacked. So there is a place for cooperation. There is a place for working together. And we also, on the other hand, so we get those positive images on the one hand, and then we get kind of negative images of the historian who's kind of an idiot and thinks everything is the fault of rogue traders who brought in these alien influences, and oh, it's so evil. And we get him saying, a few paragraphs after this, yes, these heroes of legendary proportions, whose names would undoubtedly ring down the ages of Gravelex forevermore, if enough of their bodies had remained intact to identify, turned on the corruption at its very source and threw themselves against the very citadel of the invader. Alas, faced with the overwhelming firepower of this redoubt of the unholy, they were cut to pieces. And this is kind of, this is what happens to xenophobes. This is what xenophobia gets you. A death at the hands of a vastly overpowered enemy. And a really stupid death at that. But you have these bombastic jerks proclaiming, oh, they're great heroes because they're xenophobic idiots. And I think that is very much the view we're supposed to take away. And as you might know, since you should have finished the novel by this point, it's something that gets played with at the very end. So let's keep going. So let's look at this quote. Hope for who? I asked, trying not to think of the civilians who, even as we stood here, were losing their homes and their lives. I'd be the first one to admit that I'm a self-centered hedonist, but even I felt a surge of sympathy for their plight. For half the segmentum, Amberley replied, sounding suddenly weary, and for the first time I had an inkling of the terrible weight of responsibility her calling imposed. You need to focus on the bigger picture, Ciaphas. Emperor knows sometimes that's hard. And I bring the scene up because it's very sympathetic, it's very empathetic. We see, this inquisitor who has the weight of this galaxy on her shoulders and is trying to keep humanity safe from all these invading species and possible threats, and is having to make choices and sacrifice civilian lives for the greater good, which, she would probably find unpleasant because that's a Tau thing, but you get the idea. And this brings up a stark contrast to the film Starship Troopers, where we get Carl, played by Neil Patrick Harris, lost his name for a second, but he comes in and says, well, you know what? This is a war, boys and girls, and in war, people die. And sometimes we've got to make the hard calls, and that's just tough. And it's a very bombastic, militaristic, fascist kind of future. And they're basically saying the same thing, but it's two different representations. One which is very much satirical, which is very much, critical, that's Starship Troopers, making this, the guy in the Nazi-esque stormtrooper uniform delivering this hard line about how we've got to make sacrifices and people have got to die, and the director is basically calling it out as BS. And on the other hand, we have this image of someone very troubled by the hard decisions they have to make. And so I think, if nothing else, I would argue that Warhammer presents a more realistic vision of the future than Starship Troopers. Even though they're both fascist societies, even though they're both militaristic societies, the way that people react in Ciaphas Cain seems more real to me. They're actually reacting as thinking, feeling people in a bad situation who may have been, programmed to think certain ways, but are still people. So if nothing else, I think that makes complex or makes problematic the question of, is this novel a satire, or is it parody, or is it straightforward action adventure? And so, I think it's definitely elements of all three of those, which I think has been clear. But yeah, this problematizes that question. If it's so fascist and satirical, if it's making fun of this reality, why do we get these people in empathetic situations actually dealing with processing their emotions? So I think that's one thing that Warhammer does well, despite all its, despite how over the top and exaggerated it is, it can also narrow in and focus on real humans doing real human things, even if they're superior space marine types. And we get some stirrings of intercultural cooperation, especially based around Commissar Cain and Denali saying, we've still got goodwill there. If we send troops to remove the governor, I believe they won't interfere. Well, tell that to the PDF, someone shouts, or the civilians they're butchering. Denali stares him down. Boy, God, typos everywhere. They recognize the distinction between us and the local militia. By their logic, the PDF attacked them first, so they're fair game, and the civilians merely collateral damage. They can be persuaded that it's in everyone's interest to back off, I'm sure. And again, it's that question of, civilians are dying. Are these guys making the hard decisions, or are they just being callous because it's a fascist nightmare universe that doesn't value anybody's life? And again, it's more complex than perhaps it may appear at first. And then some of the the other sources, like the military historian, try to make it seem. And there is some idea of they can actually cooperate against mutual stupidity and the PDF and the governor being a moron. And again, we see that on the micro scale with Cain and his group and Amberley meeting up with the Tau and including their own deliberations. And I also picked up on the Kroot, the fact that it's Tau and Kroot together, two alien species working in a single unit, which is a big contrast from the Imperium and its xenophobia and its, only humans, we have to be pure, no mutants, no divergents, no nothing. And so we have the idea of an interspecies multicultural empire that actually uses its multiculturalism as a strength. And, maybe there is some hope for the future. There was also a great line in there that I couldn't find when I was rereading it, otherwise I would have quoted it. But Gorok, the Kroot, basically mentions that he learned Gothic, the language they speak, which just happens to look like English to us. He learned Gothic so that he could, speak to his employers, because he's a mercenary for both sides, which is very urbane and kind of sophisticated, especially for a group that eats its dead. And again, the Tau, when the Kroot start eating one of the dead people, the Tau all seem to be looking somewhere else as their allies began their obscene meal, as though they were equally disgusted, but too polite to mention it. And it's these little hints throughout and these little indications that perhaps, the humans and the Tau aren't so different. There's similarities there. There are similar values that can be used to build cooperation and understanding, and there's a lot of hope for the future. And I see this as a very hopeful kind of novel. Another instance of Cain being an unreliable narrator in chapter 13. He's deciding that, he doesn't want to tell the troopers that that he knows what they're after, that it's actually the Tyrannid. He says, and if that left their blood on my hands, I can live with it. It's not like I haven't done far worse to far less deserving people over the years, and I haven't lost any sleep over them either. We get a little note from Amberly. I suspect this isn't entirely true. I've certainly known him to be woken by nightmares on several occasions. Which tells us two things. One, they slept together, so there's your answer to that. The will they, won't they thing. They will, apparently. And two, Cain is a pathological liar. He is an inherently unreliable narrator, and I find it interesting that even in his own memoirs, he is being an unreliable narrator. He's lying to himself, whether he even believes that it's going to ever be read again or not. And he does kind of address things to a pretended audience, so maybe he's lying to whoever he thinks is going to see this, but it's that idea of, in certain ways and in certain cultures, your journal, your memoirs, what have you, can be an aspect of performance as much as anything else. And this is an idea I picked up in when I was doing my master's in Chinese literature. And there was a genre of basically personal journal diary, or, diary entries that would then be published as the private thoughts of so-and-so. And because they knew it was going to be published, or they thought it was, they took care to paint themselves as great poets and deep thinkers and scholars and, the standard, very poetic type individual, because their personal reflection became a performance, which I find fascinating. So we get the same type thing here. And it's, if Cain lies about this, how much can we trust him about anything else? And we get another example of that in chapter 14. Now when they're running from the gene stealers and he gets pulled into another tunnel and then it collapses. Now, under any normal circumstances, the idea that I was safely sealed away from a gene stealer horde behind tons of fallen masonry would just leave me feeling intensely relieved. I can only assume I got hit on the head or something, because without a second's thought I started scrabbling at the rubble, trying to clear the way back to the corridor, which, by now, would undoubtedly be decorated with the internal organs of the others. And this goes back to what we were told at the very beginning, with the idea that Cain is perhaps his own worst critic, and is unreliable. His conception of himself, the way he views himself, is as a self-seeking coward. So when he actually turns and starts trying to save his friends and companions, when he actually tries to do something heroic, oh, it must be because I was hit on the head and had shock. It doesn't occur to him that he's actually trying to be a good guy. And that begs the question, not only, how are we supposed to read him? If Cain is unreliable, how self-centeredly are we supposed to understand him to be? Are there other instances when he's working for, an actual greater good, when he's working for a good cause and being noble and heroic, and yet is justifying it to himself as, well, I'm really just trying to protect my fraudulent reputation. Or, I'm trying to keep the troopers alive so that way they're between me and the enemy and there's plenty of bodies to absorb the fire. Is he really a hero? Is he more heroic than he seems? Or is he actually a coward? And this is one of those central questions. And yeah, I enjoy the way that they play with it. We get this little excerpt in Sulla's memoirs, and I found it interesting. And it's an exchange between the two, Brocklaw and Castine, the major and the colonel of the unit. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense, Brocklaw said, an edge of frustration beginning to enter his voice. But Castine remained unruffled. Fine commander that she was. Nothing about this emperor-forsaken rat hole makes any sense, she pointed out reasonably. If you take another look at that, especially after I fix the frappin' typo, the things I see, they're basically saying the same thing. This doesn't make sense. Yeah, nothing about this stupid planet makes sense. And yet one is frustrated and the other is reasonable and unruffled. And so it's a nice little way of playing with that bias. Getting us an unreliable narrator. And it's minor. I happen to notice it the way that Sulla's memoirs always say the women and men of our unit. Because, it might be because I'm a male and therefore have a natural bias and, assume that men go first. It might also be just because culturally the way we say that idiom, or the way we say that phrase, is men and women. So it stands out as being a little bit different. And she is from an all-female unit. She, as we've seen throughout the novel, clearly has kind of opinions about the men she serves with, and as opposed to her own regiment, which is just the best. Or, the regiment that existed before they got combined. And a lot of that goes away in later books because she remains a major character. Or, a recurring secondary character, I should say. But it's this idea, I think it's interesting to compare it with Cain's earlier comments about being disregarded for a slip of a girl, where it kind of indicates that, despite his lip service to equality and valuing the troopers on regardless of gender as their ability as soldiers, I think it indicates just a little bit of bias on Cain's part, and the idea that he just kind of sees the men as a little bit more superior, and that he's wrong for having that idea. And we'll get to that in a few moments, when basically it's women who save the day. But I think maybe I'm giving Sandy Mitchell too much credit, but I think he's playing with that in Sulla's memoirs to make you kind of notice that and go, wait a minute, these two just said the same thing. They're both good commanders. They're both good soldiers. We've had nothing but positive views of them from Cain's perspective. Even when they were, even though it took them a little while to get to work together well, they do very good jobs. So I think we're supposed to pick up on that kind of bias. And in picking up on it, in noticing it, it makes you kind of wonder, like, wait a minute, are there other instances of bias? Thinking back on Cain's comments, it basically, by contrast, it kind of serves to highlight Cain's internal bias and the inherent bias of much of the readership, I would argue, because much of the readership is male, especially, young adult, teenage male, That tends to be the go-to audience for Warhammer and for role-playing games. Perhaps maybe less young adult, just because of the ludicrous cost of it. I don't think I ever told y'all that. I think I told a different class this. To give you a bit of background, just random trivia information, if you happen to be interested in getting into Warhammer as a game, a friend of mine, good friend, had a moderate-sized army. So probably something, this is two armies going together, so probably he had maybe double this. And he had a moderate-sized army that he carried in his truck that was worth about $3,000, because that's how much it costs to buy all these miniatures and then paint them. And it is made for people with more disposable income than they know what to do with. But yeah, so that speaks to the audience. The audience is typically male. It's typically younger. Again, maybe not quite as young as other games just because of the exorbitant cost. But I think he is trying to poke at these biases by making the male readership notice Scylla's bias. It allows them to in turn examine their own and perhaps see it more reasonably. We've seen two perfectly good commanders. Why do we assume that Brocklaw is better than Castine as a readership, if you do? So yeah. So this is something that I've been kind of saving towards the end. Social satire. If this text is satire, what is it supposed to represent? And we already talked about what the various groups kind of stand for. The Imperium is kind of Western culture. It's very British. If you listen to the audiobooks, they all have British readers because it's a British company. So, fair. And the Tau are space communists. So if the Tau are communist and the Imperium is the West, basically, what are the Tyranids supposed to represent? What is it that, and let's go to the quote on page 253. Looks like they managed to get involved in the local political groups too. The Tyranid, that is. The Xenoist faction. And the Loyalists, she smiled grimly, raising the tensions between the two, splitting the PTF. Its currency to cabbages, it was cultists in both factions who started them shooting at each other and got the Loyalists to attack the Tau. Hoping to draw us into a war so we chew each other to pieces and let the Hive Fleet walk into the sector practically unopposed. I shuddered again. It's diabolical. So, what is it that can infiltrate a society in the way that the Tyranids do with the Gene Stealers? They infect some person of an alien race with Tyranid genetics and basically force them, override their mental programming and make them go seek out mates. And when they reproduce, then they have part Tyranid children that have like extra arms or chitin or mandibles. Sometimes the children are pure strain gene stealers, which are the big multi-limbed things that attack. These things. Very unpleasant. So what is it that infiltrates a society and subverts people to its cause and then makes them spread insidious doctrines that spread chaos and disorder and disarray? And as a reminder, this book came out in 2003. I am pretty sure that you can, if you read The Tau is Communist and the Imperium is the West, the Tyranid are terrorists. Which, again, the Tyranid predate 9/11, obviously. They're from, they were invented in the early 90s as part of, or mid 90s as part of this, Warhammer series. But I think that in this novel, at least, an argument can be made that the Tyrannid represent the forces of terrorism, a new threat, but that, it used to be the Cold War, the West versus communism, capitalism versus communism, and that's all they cared about. And suddenly this new force sneaks in and starts, disabling the others, causing chaos, causing them to fight. And yeah, so I think, at least in part, this book is responding to 9/11 and the events of that, and kind of the rise of terrorism as a worldwide threat. So, political allegories aplenty. We get some action parts, like when Cain is fighting the gene stealer patriarch, which is like a giant, massive one. I still fought. I sprang back a fraction too late and felt talons scrape my ribs, ripping through the armor beneath my coat and burning like fire. I swore and struck back at the thing, taking the hand which had wounded me off at the wrist. Ichor pumped from it like a fire hose, spraying me and everything else in the vicinity, and if anything, it redoubled its efforts. And this is one of those instances. This was one of the better examples I could find of Cain in combat. Several other novels mention that he's actually one of the better swordsmen in this part of the Imperium. Like he's really good. So if he's a coward fighting to preserve his life, and that leads him to duel a giant monster with his chainsword, is that still heroism? Or is it just trying to preserve his life through extremely, martial skill that makes itself look like heroism? What's the line between pretending to be a hero and actually being a hero? Which is something that is a continuous theme throughout this book. And it's never really answered. I mean, it kind of is, but I think this is one of those things that it's very much up to you whether Cain is a hero or a coward or both. And ultimately the answer is both, but to what degree, what part of the spectrum does he fall on? And that's very much up to you as the reader. I know my answer, but yeah. We get the Tau and the Guard actually fighting together. It's a great, great great military action scene, especially if you imagine it in your head. The Guard pinned down, all of a sudden the enemy has got powerful weapons and missiles, and they're struggling there, and suddenly this super sci-fi space tank rides over the hill, aims its cannon at the Guard, and then tracks up and starts shooting at their enemies while the battle suits show up and provide covering fire. And and then the Guard stands up and charges behind the aliens, and it's this really stirring, action-packed, powerful scene that in the face of all these doubts, we can work together, we can fight for the future, we can join together and join forces in the face of this enemy. And in the face of our own trained xenophobia, we can make a better world. And I think that's a really powerful message. Excuse me. So we find out that Governor Grice was the assassin all along. It turned out he had a third arm underneath his robes that he used to shoot the guy, because he is, in fact, an alien monstrosity. And, again, we get this idea of no one is what they seem. We were told that at the party at the very beginning, and, how right they were. The governor is actually a Tyrannid and is the assassin. I think this is perhaps another critique of the aristocracy. A lot of them, the ones that aren't just inbred imbeciles, are actually involved in dangerous ideas and, up to sinister things that for their own power and their own things and all that. And we don't get good views of the aristocracy or the social elite very much. And I find this especially interesting when we juxtapose it with Jurgen, who is the exact opposite. We have the highbrow, the high elite, who is actually a monster in disguise. And then we have Jurgen, who is actually, who looks like a Slav, is just a regular line trooper, is pretty much a totally worthless soldier, and doesn't have much of a brain of his own. And yet is incredibly powerful and is actually an anti-psyker. As it explains in the epilogue, Jurgen is what's called a blank, which, everybody has a psychic flame, or, everybody who has a soul has a psychic aspect. Regular people, it's like lighting a match in a dark room. Psychers, it's like lighting a candle in a dark room. So they are more attractive to the things of the warp, and they get called on more readily. Other aliens, it might be, like a lamp or something, if you follow the metaphor. Jurgen is the super rare psyker that is an anti-psyker that actually creates a void in that room and snuffs out other lights or covers them up. So he is even more powerful than the hive mind. And we see that every time he gets close to one of the gene stealers or one of the Tyranid, either they don't recognize him because he's invisible to them, or they're physically hurt by his presence. So we have this inversion of the lowly and the high. The high are actually monstrous. The apparently monstrous are actually benevolent and powerful. And that is something that Warhammer does a lot. It plays with those tensions and with, making things not what they seem. I've talked about this in other places, I think. Well, not really. There's this idea of the grotesque as being that which kind of undermines human authority. That, if this is real, then being a human, the rational universe has no reason to it, no order. Anything by H.P. Lovecraft deals with the grotesque, that kind of alien horror. And we get a lot of that with the Tyranid, that they're, weird conglomerations that shouldn't be, and they're just monstrous. And on the other hand of that, you have the sublime. These are two aesthetic principles. The sublime is so overpowering and so great that it kind of annihilates human individuality in contrast. So think of, the overpowering Space Marines. And it does a lot of, Warhammer 40K does a lot of mixing of these two. So like the orcs are so grotesque and so vile and so dumb that they actually wrap around and become able to rewrite reality according to their rules. So they're so grotesque that they become sublime, which to me is a lot of fun. So that's something else that's being done here, playing with the grotesque and the sublime, playing with the high and the low, and inverting them a lot. All right. And again, I mentioned it's Castine and Amberley that actually save the day. Cain does a good job. He's in for the kill. Jurgen helps a lot, but at the end of the day, it's Amberley who shoots the governor. And Cain goes, "Too late. Sounds as though the war's already started." "Then we'll just have to stop it," she said matter-of-factly. If ever a woman seemed capable of stopping an all-out war single-handedly, it was her. And then as they're having this brief epiphany, Castine blows down the wall with all her soldiers and comes charging in. And it's, kind of a real moment of girl power, right? It's the women who save the day. Now, they do so in the typical martial, badass fashion that you would expect of a military science fiction type novel. But it's a nice reminder to readers, and I think a nice, I think it's a lesson for the typically male readers that, hey, girls can do this just as well as you can. Those gender divides are all bullshit. Give a girl a bolt gun and she's just as deadly as a guy with a bolt gun. So I think that is one of the themes going on here, one of those subtle ideas. All right. Yeah. So my last point, and I know we're ending early today, the way the novel ends. So I stood there, paralyzed with indecision, while they staggered up the ramp and into the transport. This is being the Tau that came out of the Gene Stealer lair, aided by their fellows, and by then it was too late anyway. As I turned away, sick with apprehension, I found Amberley watching me with what I can only describe as a smile of satisfaction. For some reason, that failed to raise my spirits. If anything, it had quite the opposite effect. So, this is Grimdark, in case you forgot. This is a dark universe. Nothing is good here. And everything is xenophobic and horrible, and the Imperium is never going to get better because, amongst other things, status quo is God. So we get this end where it turns out most likely the Tau were infected by the Tyranid, and that Cain just lets him go. And Amberly, the Inquisitor, who has been fighting the Tau and the Tyranid and other aliens, is perfectly fine with this. Let them fight each other for a while. Screw those guys. But Cain feels bad. And I think we are supposed to pick up on that this is a bad ending. Cain regrets this. He feels, and he's actually like disturbed by Amberly's joy. He's bothered by it because these were his comrades. He fought beside them. They actually cooperated and, built at least the beginnings of an interspecies relationship. They had a common goal. They worked together well. There's all this potential, and suddenly it's lost. And, our hero, if nothing else, or our protagonist, if you will, is regretful of that. So I think that's a making sure that the audience knows which side they're supposed to be on. But another thing that I wanted to point out is this is kind of like the Hays Code. If you ever get into film studies, and I encourage you to, especially at our school, because we have some very good film studies professors, you will learn about the Hays Code in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Basically the early days of talking film. And it was this code that the film industry imposed upon itself that basically was like a moral code. The good guys always won. Crime doesn't pay. You can't show anybody disrespecting the police in a positive light. You can't show crooked politicians or things like that. And the bad guy always has to lose. Crime doesn't pay. And so during the 1920s, during the Great Depression, a lot of people were very anti-establishment. A lot of people wanted to root for the bad guys. They loved gangster films, and they were rooting for the gangster and watching his rise to the top as he, beat his enemies and made a bunch. And, think of Scarface. Everything's going great for like 3/4 of the movie until he reaches the top, and then suddenly it all turns to crap. And then he dies at the end. I actually haven't seen Scarface. I'm assuming he dies at the end because, well, yeah. Possible spoilers, my bad. So yeah, he mega dies. So there is this idea that, especially during the Hays era, that was done intentionally because the film studios had to show the bad guy dying. They had to show that crime doesn't pay. And everybody knew that. All the audience members knew that that was going to happen because that was the official story. But they didn't want to see that. They wanted to see the bad guy win. So what they did was they just left before the last 10 minutes of the movie, and they just ignored the ending. So it's a way in which people deal with censored media, and it's, the play between those who produce it and those who consume it as they fight to make meaning out of it and, influence the world. But I think perhaps we're supposed to take this in a similar way. We're supposed to remember that, oh yeah, this is a grim, dark world. We're always going to, bad things are always going to happen. The good guys don't really win. At best, they get a stay of execution. But we're supposed to read it and just dismiss that last section. We're supposed to imagine the good ending where they do cooperate, where Cain stops them and explains things, and, it goes on to be the start of a human Tau alliance that wipes out the Tyranid and the galaxy's good again. So maybe we're supposed to take it like that Hays Code film where we just ignore the ending because we know what the setting is going to bring us. Or maybe not. So that is all I have for Ciaphas Cain, Hero of the Imperium. I hope you enjoyed it. As a reminder, make sure on the discussion group for this week, because I'm assuming you've read it, you finished it for today. Whenever you finish the novel, make some comment about Commissar Cain, or about the novel, rather. even if it's just, I didn't like it because whatever. That's fine too. But make some comments in the discussion board. So next time we will be talking about Dungeons and Dragons. We will be doing kind of an introductory how-to on Friday and then playing a little bit more on Monday. If you are interested and want to know what the characters actually mean, I am going to recommend that you go to YouTube and look for a crap guide to D&D. This guy does what?
It's too cold out.
Yeesh. I think 16 videos. He goes through all of the classes, or all of the main classes, including several obscure ones, and then goes through races. Oh, he's got a new one. And they're all like 2-3 minutes long, so they're all pretty short. But yeah, if you are, especially if you're playing and don't know what class you want to be, take a look at these and it will give you at least a basic idea about them. So if there's nothing else, I will see you all next time. Have a good day.